Yom Kippur is something that happens to many people all the time. And that is when one truly faces the law and knows that you are supposed to live a certain way without, meaning on the outside of us, the path of morality and virtue, but also how to conduct our inner lives. We always discover the gap, meaning we just can't will ourselves to be that human being that we want to be. So when one discovers that gap, there's a moment that happens within that you can't produce, you can't program, you can't make it happen, but it's as if a healing arises from within, and somehow the work gets done outside the realm of will. And when I've shared many times, when I first began to study Christianity when I was a graduate student, and I studied grace in the work of Augustine and Luther, it helped me name something that for me had been very dormant. Meaning I touched it a few times in my religious life, but I didn't know what it was, so I went right by it. But once I really understood what grace was, then I began to see it's all over the Jewish tradition. In fact, when we say chen v'chesed, chen is grace, chesed is loving kindness. You see all over our prayer book that a God is who is filled with grace and love and loving kindness. And the tragic thing for me is many people brought up in our tradition are so focused on the law and ethics side, they don't know that we are also a religion of grace and God's love. So if Rosh Hashanah is the God of ethics and law and the spiritual moral framework, then Yom Kippur is the day of grace. So here's something that's often said to me, especially by people who are in 12-step programs. And again, my experience is that of all people that I know, no matter who are working other religions, other paths, the ones who work 12 steps understand Judaism better than anybody else. And that's because there's a clear sense that even if you, as it were, turn it over to God, and I'll talk about that in a moment, there still is a law. There's a law about using, there's a law about speaking, there's a law about lying, there's a law about accountability. You can't just say, I've turned it over to God, I'm filled with the light, I'm filled with the love, and I do whatever I want. Okay? I mean, a person in a 12-step program knows that if they start doing whatever they want, what the ego mind wants, they're going to die. And that acute knowledge creates a kind of spiritual consciousness. And that's the consciousness that I think that Judaism is after as well. Maybe we're not on the precipice of death, but we certainly are on the precipice of a spiritual and moral death, meaning a life devoid of meaning, that we're living on the outside but not from within. So when I hear people say, turn it over to God, there's a certain group of people that come to me with that. And they say, I don't understand what that means. And oftentimes there are folks who grew up in the Jewish tradition, not so much in Protestant Christianity, where that's a very, very common acceptable thought. But Jews just don't understand what this means, to give it over to God. They're not sure what's supposed to happen there. So what I've oftentimes done when I think about the sukkah, which means to live enveloped by the divine, what exactly does that mean? So here's what it doesn't mean for me, at least. It doesn't mean to give it over to God that I stop using my will and my thoughts and something happens external to me that tells me what to do. That has never happened to me. Now, I believe myself, I hope that I am a pious person, a sense of God's presence, but I've never said, turn it over to God. So I try to figure out what exactly does that mean. And here's what I think it means if I want to unpack this, is that the ego self stands between us and God. And I just want to remind you a little bit about the ego self. The ego, what I call the ego self, is a lens by which we see the world that is oftentimes shaped by all of our moral and spiritual flaws. It's not the same thing as a flawed self, but in the ego self, the flaws are alive and functioning. And if you were to look very deeply at your flaws, at your pagamim, as we say in Hebrew, you'll see that your flaws, your pagamim, actually have a logic, have an intelligence. They actually create a self, a shadow self. Now, you can't see this shadow self from the outside because it feels natural. Oftentimes when I work with a beginning person, they always say to me, but it feels natural to be angry. These are my emotions. Don't I have a right to my emotions? And that's the first lie of the Yetzer Hara, the destructive self, is it's natural. Now, it's natural to your lower nature, that's true, but it's not natural to your higher nature. So after a good deal of spiritual work, you can actually begin to see the way the shadow self operates in you. You can begin to see, well, here's where I get depressed, and here's where I get angry, and here's where I check out, here's where I get alienated, here's where I become envious, and you begin to see a pattern. Now, if you can see the pattern, and this takes, in my mind, it takes years of work to really see the pattern clearly. Once you see the pattern, there's a horrifying moment. Because what you realize is, there is an alien body inside of you that doesn't like you. It doesn't care about you, does not care about your good, does not care about your interests. It only cares about its own survival, its own narcissistic, superficial survival. So if you fall in love and you have instincts of fidelity and devotion and altruism and self-sacrifice, the Yetzer Hara says, yeah, but what about me? I need to get my needs met. That's true. But oftentimes it says exactly the wrong time in a relationship. You can trust. The Yetzer Hara will always give you the worst advice and the worst information when you need that advice or information the least. That's when it shows up. So I find people oftentimes in work, in love, in communities, they have feelings that are entirely natural, but they're natural to the lower self, and they ultimately are destructive.